So what happens when you're the first one, Sharon?
Oh, okay. Am I? Oh, wow.
All right, good.
All right. Welcome, folks, to Fundraising Lab's very first Rockstar industry interview as part of the Spark community. Today's guest is Sharon Redsky, and I am super excited about speaking with you, Sharon. I'm going to introduce you in a minute. Oh, I have already made a mistake. I have to quit my Outlook, otherwise it's going to do some bings. Okay, there we go. Welcome to live things. All right. Before we get started with introducing Sharon, what am I saying? I'm going to introduce Sharon. Sharon Redsky is the principal at Redsky Fundraising. You've got extensive experience in Indigenous organizations, and you're an award winner, YWCA's Women of Distinction Award, the Community Champion Award. So congratulations. You're a mom, a sister, an auntie, and you're loved and owned by 2 adorable dogs. Welcome to the Fundraising Lab's very first Rockstar industry interview as part of Spark. Listen, before we get into it, I do just want to say that while the magic of technology is bringing people together from many places, I'm speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm grateful for the care that Indigenous peoples have exercised that have allowed me to settle and work here. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which I think is a wonderfully ironic name, given how the First Nations people of this area have been treated. So that treaty was first signed with the British Crown in 1725, and it recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title to lands and resources and established the rules for what was supposed to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Sharon, do you want to talk about where you're from?
So bonjour, Wajish Benesi, Indigenous Kas, a Tik Totem. So I'm Sharon Redsky, and I'm on the Treaty 1 territory, which is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I want to recognize Treaty 3, Shoal Lake First Nation, which is the community that I'm a part of that supplies the water to Winnipeg. And you know what, Cathy, I am so glad to be here. I didn't realize I was here first. That's so exciting.
Yeah.
And, you know, I just want to let you know how much I appreciate the work that you've been doing. I know that, you know, generosity and being able to share and create really important spaces for, you know, these important dialogues is really critical. And so I really appreciate it. I think it's amazing the work your team is doing.
Thank you so much for saying that, Sharon. Okay, so for our audience, if you haven't yet, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat room. There is going to be a Q&A after Sharon and I sort of finish our conversation. So put your questions in the chat room, and we'll get to them after our conversation. All right, listen. There is this, you know, sort of new broader awareness among non-Indigenous Canadians right now that is calling on us to reflect and address, you know, on the practices and effects of colonization. And I would say that we in our sector are also being called upon to do philanthropy differently, in effect, to decolonize philanthropy. And I know that I'm learning, and I'm probably spending more time unlearning, and maybe unlearning is probably more important. But you're on the front line of this. And there's so much to talk about, but where do you want to start? Do you want to, we talked about a few things. Do you want to maybe start with some of the stats that you shared with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, first, I just want to be able to, you know, say that I don't speak on behalf of the Indigenous community. I'm really here just, you know, speaking about my experiences. And so one of the things I think that's really important, for everybody to know is that, Indigenous people have been philanthropists and are philanthropists, have, really focusing on, taking care of each other and taking care of Mother Earth. And, it was really, years ago through colonization and legislation that actually criminalized giving. And so communities, who would share and the value of reciprocity, I think is something that, our communities can teach, and share because it's so important. And so it just seems that, the government criminalized that, and they were very, deliberate, in their acts, in policies and legislation. And so, it's been devastating, I think, just learning and coming across that, as a fundraiser, always wondering, like, how did we get here? And I think that piece of history is, really important for the sector to understand, because, we need to learn from the past, and we need to be able to, walk together and, create a system that's going to work for everybody. And so getting to those statistics, back in 2018, I was part of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. They had, a project where, it was an opportunity to, work with some mentors. And, they brought together, I think, 22 people from across Canada. And, part of it was, getting connected with a mentor who was in the sector, but it was also working on a project. And so at that time, I had always wondered, how come our Indigenous organizations who are at the front line doing like incredible work, really through a holistic lens, aren't getting enough of the resources. And so it was at that time I put together with my mentor, Joan Blight, a survey to answer those questions, those nagging questions that I've always had. And so we broke it down into sections. One was, if people felt in the sector that, philanthropy had a role to play in reconciliation. The second piece was, what was their knowledge about the truth and reconciliation? What do they feel like some of the barriers are, and what do they hope for the future? And it was, for me, it was really kind of informative because it answered, a lot of those questions that I had. And I was happy to hear that, everybody agreed that they felt that, philanthropy did have a role to play, but they felt that some of the barriers were, the lack of understanding, they don't have a connection to the community, and what they felt, some of the things moving forward was about building respectful relationships. So I think that was really good. And then I had an opportunity to meet with Mark Bloomberg. And so, we had a few conversations because the other piece that I was always wondering about, why there wasn't more research about how much money actually goes to Indigenous organizations. And so, after a few conversations, with Mark, we were able to put together some information looking at 2018, and the, everything's available through, Canada Revenue Agency, and we had Wanda who helped out as well. Anyway, so we just kind of went through this.
Sorry, that's Wanda Bracupe from from Indigenous Peoples
Resilient Fund. Yes, yeah. And so we had an opportunity to, go through the heaps of information and pick out, as best as possible what we felt would qualify as an Indigenous organization. And, in that finding, we found out at the time that for every $178, $1 was going to Indigenous communities. So, I think there's, definitely room for improvement. But it isn't just about that. I think it's about, I think a lot about, what decolonizing means to me. And it's really about, understanding that the goal of the government was to assimilate Indigenous people. And, they wanted everybody to think like them, be like them, and we know that that didn't work, and thankfully, our communities were resilient, in spite of it all. And so when I think about,
Whoop. Little bit of a technology glitch. Isn't that something? Well, while Sharon is hopefully going to come back to us soon, I will talk a little bit. Let's see, I'm going to just talk about some of the stats that Sharon shared with me. So even though Indigenous people make up 4.9% of the population, Indigenous groups receive just over 0.5% of gifted funds. And so, for, like she said, for every dollar that that groups are getting, $178 are given to non-Indigenous groups. So we've lost Sharon, and I'm going to, let's see, what am I going to chat a little bit, and hopefully Sharon will be able to rejoin us. Matt, maybe you want to come on, and we can figure out what we're going to talk about here. Hey, Matt. Everyone,
hey, how you doing?
This is Matt from the Fundraising Lab. Welcome to live interviews, eh?
Yeah, the wonders, right? The wonders. I'm just about to text. I'm texting Sharon right now in case.
All right. Well, listen, while you're doing that, I'll just remind people that there is a Q&A. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and I can answer them while we get Sharon back. If you put your questions there, and I can answer them. Obviously I'm not I don't have any expertise in issues related to Indigenous fundraising, and we weren't only going to talk about that with Sharon, but so you can ask just general questions if you
here's Sharon.
All right. I don't see her yet. Oh, you're the host. That's why.
Hold on a second here.
Yeah. Yay! You're back.
Well, that was unexpected.
You should have seen me tap dancing, Sharon.
So I'm using my phone. I don't.
Oh, okay. That's all right. So listen, I jumped in and looked at my notes and talked about the that even though Indigenous people are 4.9% of the population, they only get like 0.5% of all the gifts that come in. That's sort of where we ended before technology got the better of us. So any last thoughts around that, or should we just move on to another question?
Oh, well, I could go on forever about that. But and I think that, I feel really strongly too that the sector has a role to play. And, I have to say, like a lot of other people, I didn't set out to be a fundraiser, and, kind of came into the sector. And the one thing that I absolutely love, about the sector is, the values we all have, about the common good. And so all of that, I have a lot of hope, that if anybody can, make a difference, it's the people who, work in this sector, and all of those, mechanisms, and I think that, it's really important, that we continue to have this dialogue, and if needing to learn more, then we need to create more time for people to have a better understanding of the history, and yeah.
Okay. Now, so that leads me to wonder, how did you fall into the sector?
Well,
fundraising, yeah.
Other people, I worked in non-for-profit, and, we realized that, one of the ways in order to achieve a lot of the outcomes that we were trying to get to was to get support, and spent a lot of time, working on government grants and, which kind of led to foundation grants. And then, I didn't even realize, until I started, investigating and, asking questions, how big the sector is. I had absolutely no idea. And so it was, a big learning curve for me. But it was really important. And, I do have to say, growing up, because my mom went to residential school,
Mm.
and, it was something that she never really spoke about, which I think is the case, for a lot of individuals. And, so it was pretty challenging growing up, in that environment. And, my life could have gone down a very different path.
Mm.
But it was, feeling a sense of belonging, especially being connected to Indigenous organizations and, having opportunities, to learn my culture was really, I have no doubt saved my life. And so knowing what it did for
Wow.
me, just made the work in a lot of our Indigenous, nonprofit organizations more meaningful, because I knew, what impact, it could have, on the lives of so many. And so, just working in the sector, began my journey, in looking at fundraising. And I have a lot to learn, still in the sector. And because, I think it's one of those sectors that evolves. And so the evolution that I see moving forward is to be more inclusive, and for it to reflect, our communities and our values.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so there's some interesting, stuff going on. I mean, I talk a lot about social change philanthropy, which I distinguish from sort of the, kind of more traditional philanthropy. Anyway, I talk a lot about social change philanthropy, and what I would say is that organizations that are involved in trying to bring about social change have a harder time raising money than organizations that are perhaps seen as more mainstream or more traditional, because there's this book called "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded," and so if we're trying to affect social change, we're asking people to change, and people don't like to change. So, raising money for change is a little bit harder.
Yeah, I've seen, and I'm really hoping that, things will start to evolve, because there's just so much value, in working with a lot of local organizations, because they have such a direct impact, on communities. And one of my sisters, Diane, has always, shared with me, and I learned from her that, if you really want to, change somebody's life, invest in women. It'll have an immediate impact, on their families and their communities. And so, I think that there's certainly a lot of, room for growth. And I had the experience, in working for an organization called the Mama Wichita Center. And so they've been around for, 38 years now, I think. And it's an Indigenous organization that started, back in the 80s with 10 people. And now it's an organization, that has close to 200 staff. So it's really growing. And the beauty of it is, they hire from community. And so, and tons of volunteers. But anyway, we were working on one project where, we wanted to be able to demonstrate that, if you invested in keeping families together, that not only is that the right thing to do, but it actually, saves the government money. And so we had, through a partnership with a foundation, a family who was interested in supporting it, and actually spent the time to come out to the community, get to know, what the program is about and the organization. And what was nice was it wasn't only, the donor itself, but the children and the grandchildren. And so, I think it really gets down to, building authentic relationships. And I know that that takes time, but it sure is worth the effort, and I just think about how as fundraisers, how talented everybody is, and, how many processes and mechanisms are set up so we can understand donors. And I do think that, if we apply those same tools to building partnerships, with some of our local Indigenous communities, as well as our Indigenous organizations, that we'll be farther ahead.
So one comment and then a question. It sounds like with the donor you talked about, that was really like a donor as partner versus donor as just like a ATM or just donor writing a check. So, and I think that's what I see a lot in the world of social change philanthropy, that donors are increasingly prepared to really understand the organization.
Yeah. And I do think that, in doing that, we get to, share like the incredible resiliency of communities and how communities, are very unique, in getting things done, at the grassroots level. And I see that right across the country, and we have, small, large, Indigenous organizations, who are doing so much, for their community, through generosity and reciprocity, that I know could do so much more, with the right investments. And we have an organization, here in Winnipeg, and well, there are so many, but it's called the Bear Clan. And then there's one that's called the Mama Bear Clan. And so it's just based on volunteerism. And, they're out, a few times a week, just checking on brothers and sisters and, walking the streets. And, everybody, has a role to play, in ensuring that, we're taking care of one another. And yeah, there's a lot to do for sure.
So from a fundraising perspective, I mean, you work with a lot of Indigenous organizations. Like, what are you seeing from a fundraising perspective?
Well, I think from a fundraising perspective, part of it is, communities know how to take care of one another. And so part of it is just kind of what I had to run into in realizing that, there's all these processes and, things that have been set up and ways of doing things, in the fundraising sector that, requires, some time to get engaged with and see where there's common ground. And I think, as sectors and, as the stuff I see firsthand, in some of the communities, we're all trying to achieve the same thing. It's just that understanding, of gift acceptance policies, like all of these, processes, that, have been honed in and specialized, in the sector. It's
Right.
just understanding that, and figuring out, what's kind of common in a lot of that. So.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, we work with a lot of small and medium-sized organizations, and systems and processes are the thing that we spend a lot of time working on organizations with that, because, I mean, this, you can, if you can secure funding and then struggle to receipt it and recognize it and keep the donors sort of aware of what's going on, it's easy to lose that donor as a longer term donor. So the fundraising is like an iceberg, right? Like people see the donations that are made as fundraising, but really about 90% of the work is below the water in terms of all the things that we do. So I guess, are you spending much time with your clients working on that 90% under the water.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing I think is really important is, I just had this conversation, with a colleague of mine yesterday about, in the fundraising sector, we define donors, in a certain way, foundations, individuals. And I think that, we as an Indigenous community, we're all donors, because of, uh, the fact that we're, sharing our time, our skills, and I think the other thing that I learned quite a bit about is that, from a cultural perspective, we're all gifted with a certain gift. And so I see that, in our communities, and so, yeah, it's about, just framing things and, elevating the strength that our communities, have been doing, for thousands of years about taking care of each other and taking care of Mother Earth and, coming from that perspective. So it's a lot of, okay, so donor might mean this in this context, but it actually means this, and so it's, yeah, it's been a growing experience for me, for sure.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting that you say that, because even the definition of who one can give a donation to is also a pretty arbitrary, well, it's arbitrary. I mean, it's part of the Canada Revenue Agency rules, right? So I know that one of the challenges for lots of communities, not just First Nations communities, is that communities do take care of each other. And oftentimes it's just groups of volunteers who get together and take care of the community, and they're not a qualified donee. And so donors don't get a tax receipt if they give to somebody who's a non-qualified donee.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I believe it was years ago, a lot of our First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, communities are considered qualified donees. And I think they changed that in 2016, which kind of makes it a requirement now that they send a letter to Revenue Canada to be recognized. So it's kind of one of those unfortunate things, they're another, yeah, another layer. And so, yeah, I think that, there are definitely some processes, and some legislation that have been set up, and they don't always work for communities. And, Cathy, I have to acknowledge that, back to the time of the fact that they criminalized giving, there has been a lot of changes to legislation and to the Tax Act that I'm not sure, if consultation with, our Indigenous governments have happened. Because at the end of the day, we want to be able to support systems, and processes that are going to enable. And so I think there's been a lot of gaps, in the system, and a lot of decisions that have been made without the proper consultation. And there's been some unintended consequences, of that. And so it's, I think when we think about reframing philanthropy, it's really important to have, the right people around the table, and to be asking questions, and to be able to, make decisions to make sure, this whole sector can be more equitable, for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an issue. There's a lot, the sort of stats that you shared about how much money goes to Indigenous people versus everyone else. Lots of communities have those kinds of challenges, right? Where whether it's, members of the Black community or Muslim community, not much money is going to some smaller communities. And it's disproportionately less than the size of the communities.
Yeah, and I think we can recognize that COVID has certainly made that, more challenging. We have a lot of First Nation communities, Métis and Inuit communities, that have been hit hard, by COVID, and we can see, certainly the challenges of not having, affordable housing, access to clean water. A lot of them are remote. And so, it's really important, that we, as a sector recognize too that, there's always a perception for a lot of the Indigenous community that the government just pays for everything, and so that isn't the case. So I think that, it's really important, for our sector to recognize that. And, I do know that, the First Nation, government and communities have had to take, the government to court for underfunding education and, child and family services,
Yeah.
Of Cindy Blackstock. And
she's a friggin' hero.
She is, and there are so many people, who have been working really hard, and will continue to work hard, for our communities to raise that awareness. And so, it's really, I think it's important that we change that narrative as well.
Yeah. Nice. All right. I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions. I don't see any in the chat, but Matt, maybe you can either pop in or let me know in the chat if there's any on the landing page.
Yeah, so we have one from Wanda. And Wanda's asking, what do you believe are the possible reasons foundation leadership stalls in actioning engagement, even though their mandates speak of doing things differently and wanting meaningful relationships?
That's a big question.
Yeah. We come out of the gates flying here. So.
I think it's an important question, and I think it's important, that was asked, and I think it's really important that more people are questioning things, and I don't think that there's any one solution to it. But I do think that, there's certainly opportunities to, have more voices, at boards around where decisions are being made. I think that, will make a huge difference in reshaping, how we can be more equitable, or in our funding in the future. So certainly making room to ensure that those voices are being heard at every level. And one of the things, particularly around the truth and reconciliation, which is really important, across Canada, in addition to the murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, there were 231 recommendations there, is that, we have to remember our past, and we have to, create a future working together. And we can only do that if we, are working and having relationships, and creating those environments to do it, and having some difficult conversations. I think it's, something that's really important as well. And so I just encourage people to continue to ask those questions.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in if I may. One of the things that I'm seeing, well, we touched earlier, I think, how people don't like to change when I was talking about social change, philanthropy, and people lead foundations, and they too are people who don't necessarily like to change. And one of the things I'm seeing is that leadership by some foundations will, chart the course for other foundations to follow. And so I don't know if that's Wanda from the Indigenous People Resilience Fund, but certainly, there's a leader. They're changing and reframing the narrative. I see foundations really grappling with this notion of equity and how to ensure that non-qualified donees who are doing so much important work are being supported. And I see, and these are all nascent. These are all like just like little buds that are bursting out of the earth. But some foundations who are looking at offering organizations general operating support instead of program-based support, which we know from all the research shows us that it's sort of hollowing out organizations and starving them of the really necessary funds that they need to just run the organization. So these changes are happening. I also see, the movement like community-centered fundraising, where people just want to blow up the way that we're doing it and start anew. And I think it's going to be a constellation of all of these different actors. So, folks who are leading by example, folks who are challenging the status quo. And, we're beginning to see the change. I don't think it's nearly as quick enough as most people would like to see, but there is, I think, some heartening movement in a new direction. Thanks for that question, Wanda. Let me go back. Still no questions in the chat. Matt, come on back and let us know, or send me a note if there's any questions in the landing page.
Well,
Yeah,
I do. Oh, okay.
Sorry. Yeah, nothing yet, but I'll let you know.
Okay.
Okay, that's great. I do think that, the Indigenous Peoples Resilient Fund, has been, just such a positive development. I know that, when COVID hit, it was really devastating for a lot of our communities, who were just looking at trying to purchase, basic PPE and, making sure that, there's emergency food programs and, all of this, incredible work. And so it was really amazing to see that, the Indigenous Peoples Resilient Fund was able to get established, reach out to communities and distribute money in a really quick time. And so I do have to say that, it does take leadership 100%, but now we know, through this experience with COVID, that things can be done quicker. And so, I just really encourage, all of us to do our parts to be a part of, making sure that, we're making things quicker, but that we're also being more responsive to community needs. I think that is always one of the challenging pieces for me, because, when I work with a lot of Indigenous organizations, it isn't just one thing that they're doing. It's a really holistic approach, to supporting community. And so that understanding and making sure that, we have systems that can support that is the kind of change we need to have moving forward.
Yeah, and you just made me think that one of the other reasons perhaps that change is slow is that our sector is, the governance structure is such that it's not always easy to be quick and nimble. I mean, we have a board of directors that govern our organizations, and oftentimes that structure does not allow for a really quick pivot into a new direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is entirely possible. And, it kind of reminds me of, another incident. And so, in looking back, years ago, unfortunately, sometimes it's bad things that happen that can kind of kickstart things, and for anybody who doesn't know, there was this beautiful young soul, Tina Fontaine, who was brutally murdered. And, it really demonstrated, the outcry, across the country about, violence against Indigenous women and girls. And here in Winnipeg, we didn't have a 24/7 safe space for youth. And it was actually Tina's aunt who had hoped that that would happen. And it was, through foundations and, government support that an organization called the Dinaway was able to, open up what is now called Tina's Safe Haven, which is a 24-hour youth center. And so, I often think about, a lot of our community organizations and the uncovery, of the graves across Canada, it just, it's really heavy. And at the same time, we know it's our children, speaking to us and, encouraging that change. And so a lot of communities, and organizations, really are looking forward to, an investment in healing programs. There's still a lot, cultural programs, language programs, there's, a lot of investment that needs to, support and enable, our communities that, again, isn't always just funded by the government. There's a lot of really amazing work, happening in our communities. And so, we have some First Nation communities who, want to look at, redeveloping youth centers. And I think there's one that just, developed a skate park. And there's just so many different, things that can be supported. Yeah.
So we have another question from Emma.
Okay.
What advice do you have for foundations in managing the tension between being transparent and accessible, having a level playing field for applicants, and needing to nurture relationships within Indigenous networks, which will be limited in nature and thus may be excluding some potential partners?
Okay, wait, let's break that down so I understand it. So the tension between transparency, building relationships with Indigenous communities, and what was the other thing?
Yeah, the tension between transparent and accessible and accessibility, and then and needing to nurture relationships within Indigenous networks, excluding, and that may exclude some potential partners.
Got anything, Sharon?
Well, I think the only experience that I can share is I know that, in Winnipeg, we have a large foundation. And so I do know that they're, they've included, I don't know if there's one or two maybe Indigenous board members. So I think that, is a really good step forward. And then most recently, we have, I think, the only CEO that I know of anyway, in a large foundation, who's Indigenous.
Right.
And, that's a pretty recent development. And, I think the other piece is, relationship and engagement. And it's kind of it's really important to reflect as an organization, doing a cultural audit is always a good step, and I encourage foundations to do that. And it's really just an assessment of, what do I know about the Indigenous community? What ways do we ensure that we hear from Indigenous communities? Do we have people on the board? Do we have staff? Do we, engage? And how do we make sure we, have an understanding? And so, I think there are tools and certainly ways that foundations can do that because, across the country, our Indigenous communities are very unique, and what might work in one community may not work in another. And so I do think that it, needs to reflect, that particular community. And so, we as fundraisers are the best in building relationships, and so I think that using some of the tools we have already is really important. And there will be tension. Not everybody is going to, see the same value and, and at the same time, I think Murray Sinclair, when he, had talked once about, the Truth and Reconciliation, it was really the government of Canada. And I think what he called it was Canada's best social marketing campaign to portray Indigenous people a certain way.
Mm.
Absolutely a lot of unlearning, that needs to happen. But it can be done.
Well, I just want to pick up on one of the things you said about, what might work in one community may not work in another community. And I think that is one of the, it's one of the frustrations that I hear sometimes from donors who feel like, let's just develop a program that works and then scale it across the country and run that program everywhere in the country, without recognizing that to a degree, like I know an organization that sort of is nationwide, built on that model, but even within each community, they're applying the model somewhat differently. And so this is, again, one of those challenges of social change. It's not a cookie cutter approach. And that takes time, and that takes understanding the community that you're working in. And, we do live in a society where we expect really quick or short-term solutions to really long-standing issues. And we just have to honor and trust in the process. And sometimes that is an uncomfortable place for people to be, and for folks who are accustomed to perhaps working in a sector where they can just throw money at a problem and fix it, or accustomed to quarterly returns. That notion of trusting in the process and working at the pace that works for the community might be antithetical. Like, they can't believe that there's not a quicker way to do something.
Yeah. And you know what? I do think that a lot of our communities, 100%, have the solutions, and so, sometimes it's just building those relationships, and having those connections with them to figure things out. And part of the shift, I think, what I would like to see, and I think what was reflective and what's so promising about the Indigenous Peoples Resilient Fund is that, it isn't that they just fund like one particular thing. It's more about the community sharing what their need is, and so I think that, if we can shift, that a little more, that would be really reflective, because, I've worked in nonprofit where, we've had to figure out, how we were going to get funding for a program, that was really, keeping our kids safe, keeping them engaged. But, we had to piecemeal it together, because this one would only fund this particular thing, and this one over there. And so it, it can be a real challenge. And so, and I think that, as fundraisers, we often play a very important role in articulating, and helping, those with influence over, who's making decisions, over money, to help them understand that, I think it's, something that, is really important.
We do, as a sector, have this huge contingent of people with a lot of influence who support our sector. And so, I think we do have an opportunity to engage that. So maybe that's part of the conversation, is how do we engage those folks in a different way. All right, Matt, we're getting close to the end. So if there are no more questions, Sharon, let's see, Matt's saying, here he is.
I think we're all questioned out.
We're all questioned out. All right. So Sharon, any last words of wisdom or questions that you want to ask or comments that you want to make. The last word is yours.
Oh, wow. That
You know
doesn't.
what? It's not going to be, because I'm going to say goodbye at the end. I'll probably say something else, but the last meaningful word is yours.
Well, I think for anybody who happens to be listening, I think it's, really important, to think about, the kind of changes we want to see, and to be able to, start asking internally, what differences, do I want to see? And, what ways, can we ensure that things are more equitable? And, what very basic steps we can start doing, and I think the more, as individuals, we start to ask that, the more we can come together, to encourage that. But I do have a question for you, Cathy.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, over the years, because you've supported Indigenous communities, in your practice, what have you seen and what are your hopes?
So I would say that I have learned and unlearned a lot in the last few years, and I want to thank folks like you, Sharon, and there are some others who have been part of my learning journey. And so I guess I want to thank Paul Nazareth for mentioning my name to you, and thank you for reaching out to me so that this relationship started. What I have seen is organizations that, really didn't have, like you said, the systems or the processes or the understanding, really, of, in some cases, that the charitable sector existed the way that it did. I mean, you sort of started our discussion today talking about that. My hope is that I'm doing some work right now with an organization, and we're really talking about, and so they're new, and so we're talking about what does it mean to start out a philanthropy program in a different way. What does it mean to, like, really out of the gates be decolonizing philanthropy, and having conversations about how philanthropy can contribute to reconciliation, but in a really with that word resilience, because there's an old school of philanthropy where the people who are being served are painted as victims, rather than recognizing the resilience that they have for making it through the crappy system and that they've been put through. So, I mean, my hope is that as a non-Indigenous person, I will say that the tragedy of the graves being discovered has rocked people, non-Indigenous people, in a way that I was surprised. Like, I knew actually have some family members who are Indigenous, so I know a little bit about, perhaps know a little bit more than the average non-Indigenous person. But it was interesting when the news came out to hear friends say, non-Indigenous friends say, I had no idea that residential school was that awful. And so there is a new awareness, and my hope is that we can harness that awareness to actually affect some meaningful change. And I'm starting to see organizations that are doing work, and so I have a former client that it's not Indigenous led, but they do a lot of work with Indigenous communities. When they work in community, it's all sort of in partnership with Indigenous folks around water, and they're starting to take off because the work that they do is so important, and the model is about collaboration. It's not the sort of traditional, we're going to come in and do everything. It's working with communities. And so my hope is that more and more of that happens. As somebody who's worked in community development for so many years, when I see that, I just see that as being like really good community development work. Like you don't go in and tell people how to do things. You ask what the expertise is already and what the solutions are that the community has, and then you work together to reinforce those. So I'm seeing I am seeing hope. I'm seeing that is that's happening. Groups are coming together, and I think I'm seeing that people are looking at philanthropy as a way to make a difference. So sorry, I could go on forever about this, Sharon. My goodness, you're a good interviewer. I remember once, so here's a big difference that I see. I remember many years ago when Attawapiskat had the huge water challenge and states of emergency were called, and it happened frequently. And I remember talking to someone who said, the problem is too big. What's my donation dollar gonna do? It's not gonna make a difference. And I think now what we're seeing is that we're finding ways to invite donors in to be part of the solution in a meaningful way. And I'm seeing that as a big difference. So, there's hope. There's still so much work to do, but I'm seeing hope. And I will say that I felt really hopeful when the government, finally dealt with. I can't remember. I'm sorry, I've forgotten Cindy Blackstock's organization's name, but so what's it called again?
Society.
Yeah,
the Caring Society.
Yeah. So glimmers of hope, and I guess my hope is that we continue to fan those sparks so that they turn into flames and really engage philanthropy in a meaningful way in support of something that is just so important.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the closing words of Murray Sinclair, he has always said that, reconciliation is going to take everybody, and so I just encourage people to continue to be engaged and to continue to advocate for the kind of change that, again, is going to make things more equitable, for Indigenous and, for the Black community and for, lots of communities who, really, want to show up in their resiliency. Yeah.
I am so grateful to you, Sharon, for coming today and speaking with me and with everybody who has a chance to listen to you. I look forward to many conversations with you, and let's figure out how to do some of that work together that we've been talking about.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.